We're going through a series in Mark, and we're in chapter 10. And the passage and the title of our sermon today is Convenient Covenant. And so we'll be going into Mark chapter 10, verses 1 to 12, and we'll be reading through the ESV. Mark chapter 10, verses 1 to 12. And Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. Some Pharisees came, tested him by asking him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" "What did Moses command you?" he replied. They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law," Jesus replied. "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be reunited to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." When they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, "Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery." This is the word of the Lord. And so what we see in our passage today is that, again, crowds of people are coming towards Jesus. And as was custom, he taught them. And so our first idea of our passage today is that there's something about teaching. Jesus and his ministry always had the element of teaching in it. And I think whether we are being formed by Christ and his teachings and his spirit, by being integrated into the life of the church, whether you're being intentional with your formation or whether you're not, we're all being formed. You are all being formed one way or another. You're being formed by somebody or someone. You're being formed by culture. You're being formed by education, the systems. Formation is happening one way or another. And so I think we as people, we have a natural thirst for knowledge, for growth, for experience. And I feel like memes, like reels, they've kind of hacked that a little bit. Social media companies today have hacked a way into feeding that need, that insatiable need that we all have to want to grow, to have insight, to progress, to further, whatever it is, whatever field we're part of, we want to grow into it, we want to master it. And so I feel like just that short reel, it can give you this sense of like, oh, I have this nugget of truth. I feel like I could be a better leader. I could be a better, whatever it is that your algorithm feeds you. You feel like, man, it's filling the gaps of my knowledge. And so back in those days, they didn't have that kind of access, right? They didn't, although at the time it was quite like revolutionary that Romans had built the roads. And so there was a communication boom during that time. We're seeing something on a whole nother scale, another level. But back then, for the first time, roads opened up. And so exchange of ideas were happening. But we today, I feel like fast forward, we've kind of hacked the system. Anywhere we go, when you're on the subway, everyone's on their phones, everyone's there's a feeding of information constantly. There's a bombarding of information constantly to us. We're being formed. We're being formed through the things that we consume, by the things that we see, by culture we're being formed. And so teaching being at the center of Jesus' ministry is very instructive to us. And the way that the Jewish people did it it's called a didactic way, right? It was an oral tradition. It was a way where they talked and they shared stories with the purpose of teaching, with a lesson behind it. And so the Jewish people, they were all about sharing knowledge and sharing lessons through oral tradition. And they also had a very specific way in which they taught their youth as well. It's quite well documented, whether you go on, just secular Jewish people or people that are Jewish, Messianic Jews that are Christian. They talk about this. And there's a story of a Nobel Prize winning Jewish physicist who once said that one of the ways that his mom was able to train him to be the physicist that he was was that instead of asking, what did you learn today? Mom would always ask him, did you ask a good question today? What was the good question that you asked? And so there's a tradition among Jews where for education, it's not like just indoctrination and just like information and memorization. There was that kind of element. Of course, they memorized scripture and such. But they really had this desire to teach a child how to be curious, to inquire, to ask why, to go deeper, to reflect. And so it's called like a Socratic method of like asking questions, persistent questioning in the search of clarity. Consistent asking of questions. I want to know more. What's behind that? What does God mean when he says that? Like asking. To ask is to grow. So you can know how a child, where his mind and space is, where his heart is, by the types of questions that he asks. The types of questions that a child asks kind of point us to maybe where they're curious at. And where they're curious at, they'll naturally go towards it and they'll grow into it. And so like, what sort of questions are you asking when it comes to your faith with God? Because depending on what sort of questions you're asking in regards to your faith, kind of reveals where you may be. Do you even ask God about anything? Or do you mostly ask ChatGPT? ChatGPT is pretty good these days for a lot of practical things. But it's like, even with ChatGPT, what sort of questions do you ask it? When you go to school, what sort of questions are you asking? The questions that we ask show us where we are and where we're going. And having the living Word of God in us, in our diet, in our minds, in our attention, in our thinking space, we're asking questions, we're chewing on things that we learn, things that we've heard about God, opening the Bible before we open IG when we wake up or TikTok. When we choose to say, God, like your first place, and we come into the place of his presence, I believe it's a winning strategy for Christians. I feel like we lose if we lose that first step, if we don't prioritize the first fruits. And it's not a comfortable thing to talk about tithes, but it's like tithes is considered first fruits. So the first fruits of my labor I give unto the Lord. Even in my time and in my day, the first fruits of my time and my day, my morning, I give unto you, God. To give you my attention, to give you my time, my mind, my meditations. It's a proven anchor to the Christian soul to start the day in his word, to inquire, to meditate, to feed our souls with the living word. How can we do it any other way? And I believe that Jesus and Mark, as he's talking about Jesus' ministry, we can get caught up with the miracles and the tension and the demonized child and whatnot. But at the center of every ministry moment that Jesus has, he's trying to teach his people. He's trying to help them see what's the essential thing, what's the essence of following God and knowing God. Now, in verse 2 of our passage today, verse 1 was they all came together and they're like now coming to Jesus and Jesus taught them. And in verse 2, it says some Pharisees came to test him. They came and tested him by asking him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And so the Pharisees, they know the game. They know how it works. Jesus is a rabbi, so they come to ask questions. Now, the questions reveal a little bit of their heart and where they're coming from, because immediately Jesus knows that they're testing him. Mark knows. They knew it was all a test because it was a controversial topic of that time. To talk about divorce and marriage was a controversial topic among Jews at the time. And truth has to be tested. And so Jesus invites the questioning. But it's interesting, and I want us to see the insights behind how Jesus answers the Pharisees. Now, I want you guys to also understand a little bit of the backdrop as well, is that it's not just he's not just asking just a question of like, is it okay for one person to do it? It's not a casual question. It's really a theological and even a legal that had implications to the state. But, Jews it was a monotheistic state, so it had the law and the state, the religion and state together. But it had vast implications. And back in those times, they had more liberal schools and more conservative schools. And the more liberal view was that you could divorce For something even as trivial as burning dinner or finding someone else more attractive, a man could divorce his wife. So this was a liberal side, Hillel school. They had a more liberal view of Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 1, which was like, you could just divorce your wife. You just need to hand her a certificate. Now, there was a more stricter view, more conservative view, and they permitted divorce only in the cases of sexual immorality or unfaithfulness. And so they interpreted it more narrowly, the Deuteronomy 24 chapter 1. That was a Shammai school of thought. And so the Pharisees, when they're asking this question, they're trying to set up a trap. So if Jesus was going to support the more lenient view, they could start going, oh, Jesus is liberal. But if Jesus was more strict, they'll be like, oh, he's too strict. So they were just trying to set him up in a way where if Jesus sided with one side, then they could have some form of leverage and like angle in which they could start criticizing his teaching ministry. Now, if there was obviously a sensitive topic of divorce, there was probably in the crowd people that had been divorced. There were people that were struggling with it. And so it's definitely a tense environment. It's like Jesus is being tested and confronted at this time. And so in verse 3, it says, Jesus says, "What did Moses command you?" So Jesus answers a question with a question. So what did Moses say? And they said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. In verse 5, this is Jesus. He says, "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law." Jesus steps into this debate of divorce, and he doesn't just answer the question, but he redefines the whole conversation. He shifts it to a different level. He first answers a question with a question, and then he gives a statement that says, it's this law, this concession that Moses gave to you was because of your hard heart. In other words, this law was a concession to sin, to human sinfulness and brokenness. It's not the original design of God. So marriage was designed ultimately for the union of one male and one female together, and for them to be together, to be united in covenant relationship. Now, Moses providing this way out and saying, yeah, you could do it if you hand a certificate. It's not something that you can draw from to just use as an excuse to divorce your wife for trivial reasons. But it was actually given because of human brokenness and for situations that because of our brokenness and humanity, we could not be united with our wife or our spouse. And so Jesus was saying, he's saying it's a merciful response to you. It's not the ideal design. Marriage was designed for one person and one other person to join together, male and female, to join together and to become one and not to be separated. Jesus is saying, my ideal and my design is greater. It's a faithful, lifelong commitment. Marriage is meant to be a commitment, a lifelong commitment of fidelity. It's a lasting thing. And he ties it, and this is how he does it in our passage today. He ties it to Genesis, right? To creation order. So in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, he says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." And so Jesus is taking it all the way back to creation order, to the beginning. And so he's saying to all the Pharisees and all the religious people and in the crowd, all the Jews and Gentiles, saying, yo, it's not meant to be separated. This was my original design. Divorce, it's not a matter of convenience. It's not a matter of like, oh, it didn't work out. For trivial reasons, you can't just divorce them. If you are joined together, my intention was that you are flourished together in that context of marriage. It's for you to be in union with one another and to reflect what my intent was, my creation was meant to be. And so this is kind of like quiet. It's quiet for the Pharisees. The Pharisees are hearing Jesus, and he's gone boom. He's like put the standard so high, and not just high. He's kind of put it beyond their paradigm of like, whoa, we thought it was about the law. we thought it was about what was permissible or not permissible. We were looking at what's allowed. But Jesus is saying, I want you to see my heart. I want you to see God's design. It was never meant to be that you can just divorce flippantly. It was never meant to be that there would be brokenness in marriage. Marriage was given as a gift for people to enjoy and to really flourish in. And so in some senses, Jesus might sound harsh. What do you mean, Jesus? What if there's like these cases where there needs to be divorce, the person's not, the other side, they're not the same person, they're not committed, they're not faithful. Because today it's very interesting. He's so direct. In Matthew chapter 19, in the same kind of account of this teaching, there's at least an exclusion in Matthew chapter 19. There's an exception. Jesus says, on the account of like sexual immorality and adultery, you can divorce your wife. But in this case, Jesus doesn't mention any of that. It feels so harsh, so direct. Jesus is like, yo, this is my design. This is how I intended it. And so what you are talking about, what Moses is talking about, is a concession. And he doesn't even give the exceptions of like sexual immorality and unfaithfulness. And so we have to kind of think about a little bit within our passage today why that is. Because Jesus' response seems more strict and conservative and stringent with no exceptions. But I believe that within the context of our passage today, we kind of see why he's so direct. And I want to kind of unpack that for us as well. So the concept of like an unbreakable marriage and covenant was definitely like to say that there was no way that you could divorce your wife. It was very like mind-blowing to these people because divorce was quite common during that time, especially among the wealthy, especially among the influential. They really it was more common than not. And doesn't that remind us of today? It almost feels like in culture today, in media today, there's more divorces. And as I get older, it's even like people that I didn't just see in media, but people that I know. And it is a reality. It happens. Maybe in Korea, USA, in developed nations, divorce happens quite commonly. And so back in these days, they were like, it's so common. And now Jesus is saying, yo, it's not. Why, Jesus? Why are you so adamant, so strict about it? Why are you putting it down so hard? And I believe that within the context of our passage today, we see it. Jesus is challenging the religious institution. I want you guys to see the broader battle, that's the tension that's been there all throughout Mark. The religious institution, the religious leaders, they've established a system of law and moralism that is very self-interest, that has a lot of self-interest. A lot of these laws that they've added onto the Torah were ways in which they could benefit from it, ways in which they could use it as power over the people. And so the religious institution had established a way in which they could put different interpretations on laws that they wanted and laws that they didn't. It became very political. It was politically driven. It was very self-serving. And so Jesus seems very harsh to the topic of divorce, but I believe that he was trying to make a point. He was trying to push back to the religiosity, the cultural religiosity that had settled into Judaism. People were always talking about what was acceptable. People were always talking about how far can I toe the line of what's acceptable and be within the line and live my life how I want to. We use God's law to serve our agenda, to serve our happiness, to serve my happiness, to serve my needs. And if I can just meet the minimum requirement on the law, then I'm free to do what I want. And so that was so prevalent within Judaism that I believe that Jesus was so straight and direct because he was saying, I know what you're doing. I know you're asking me this question to create a concession. But what I was more concerned about what I'm more concerned about when we talk about marriage is not concessions, but I'm more concerned about covenant. I'm more concerned about what covenantal love means, what committed love means, what sacrificial love means. And marriage was a gift given by God to his people to reflect the love of God. The love of Jesus to the church is often talked about. as marriage, the bride. The bride of the church is his bride. Marriage was given as a beautiful expression of God's commitment and his love toward us. And so here we are, the religious people, they're talking about concessions. Can I divorce my wife on this or not? Can I do this or not? Can I sin or not? How far can I come to this line and be acceptable and forgiven and free so that I can live my life how I want? And so the law and God had become so self-serving that Jesus was directly addressing this issue by saying, yo, you miss the point. You miss it. You miss it altogether. It's not about just to do enough to make it. It's not about what's acceptable so that I'm okay with God. But it's about pursuing God. It's about him pursuing you. When we talk about marriage and it's like the romantic aspect of marriage, it's like it begins with pursuit. It begins with courtship, getting to know somebody, getting to see what's on their heart, what they enjoy, what they like to do in their spare time, where they turn to when they're stressed. What's their dreams and aspirations? There's a courtship. There's a getting to know. We share our dreams. We walk together. We spend time together. And marriage, it certainly incorporates that. You know, the earlier stages has a little bit more chemicals going on. But even as you go into a year, later parts of your marriage, it's like, man, we're in year 9. We just celebrated year 9 in January. But it's like, man, we become friends. We become companions on this journey. And the more and more when we talk about marriage, there's something beautiful about two people coming together and saying, yo, I'm committed to you. I still want to pursue you. I still want to prioritize you. I still think about you. I still appreciate you. And it's those little moments that keep the marriage going. We got 3 kids right now, dude. We're in the thick of it. 3 young kids. My first is 6, 3, 1. Like, date nights. We don't have parents. No parents nearby. It's like we don't get regular date nights. We have to fight for it. God sends it from heaven, like manna from heaven sometimes. But it's like we have to fight for it to still express to one another our affections for each other. Because when you're in marriage for a while, things can get repetitive, right? And so it's like when we're talking about marriage, it's a lifelong commitment. There's sure differences. There's days that Janice and I fight. There's days where it's not as easy. We're like trying to like look forward and say, hey, this is a season. And we're like fighting sometimes. We're fighting one another and we're fighting for something together. And so marriage, it's like it can be a lot of different things. But if I'm like talking to Janice and I'm like, Janice, like, is this enough for you? Can I do just this much and you're happy? If I start talking like that, that's crazy. I'll be going home. Like my passcode's gonna change, bro. She's like, is that enough, bro? Like I'm gonna start losing access to things, And it's like, how much do we sometimes treat God in that way? Of like, God, is this enough? Can I give you this? I'm gonna just do this, God. Can you bless this? And it's like, I think in the context of a father-child sense, like when I look at my child, if my child would do that, I would understand. But it's like the idea of marriage elevates this idea even more, that God would consider the church his bride, that he desires such an intimacy with us, a relationship with us that's not just so transactional, that he wants actually to know us. He wants us to be known by him, and he wants to be known to us as well. And so he wants a relationship, a real authentic relationship that isn't about what concessions I can have, what freedoms I can have, how much can I do this while still being a Christian. If my mind is there, then how much am I really stepping into? And I think the song was on point of like, how do I step into that realm of faith where my heart is actually, if it kind of flutters a bit. And for a male, it's a little bit different. It's interesting to say that, but it's like, for my heart, it is like there is a fluttering of my heart too. When I was dating Janice, it's like, and when my 3rd child now smiles at me, I get flutters too. There's something about children that can make my heart move. But think about like what makes your heart flutter. When was the last time God God's love made you flutter? When was the last time that God's love for you impacted you so much that it moved you to stop what you're doing, to stop your regular day, and to stop and pause and say, God, I'm grateful. And maybe tears fall down. Where you just take a moment to be so grateful, beyond words, to just say, God, you've been so good to me. God, I want to live for you. I've fallen short in so many ways, but you've been faithful to me. To have that kind of relationship with God, to have intimacy with God, to have this covenantal relationship with God. And I feel like if I'm towing the line of like what I can do and what I can't do, I feel like my mind isn't even in that space. And so these religious leaders, they're like concerned about these concessions. And Jesus is like, yo, my heart from the very beginning was love, was covenantal love. And I think it's a thought-provoking question for us today as well. Do I seek God or do I seek concessions? Do I seek to live by His design? And to seek to live by His design, I'm seeking His heart. When was the last time you sought His heart? What's on your heart, God? I look around me and my peers, and what's on your heart? Because it looks chaotic. The politics, it looks chaotic. The world looks chaotic. It doesn't look bright. But what's on your heart, God, for my generation? God, what's on your heart for such a time as this? God, what's on your heart for my life or for my occupation, what I do in my time, where I live? What's on your heart, God? And when do we take a time to listen and say, God, I want to know what's on your heart. What's your design for me? Do I live seeking His heart, or do I seek to just live in His rules? And if we live in His rules, it will only go so far. There will always be a ceiling. And it's almost like, I feel like if you've had teaching experience, like, as you get older, I don't think I taught in any sort of like official, but like as a pastor you teach, and I don't know, like you get to interact with kids. I love interacting with kids, and you just know when a kid trusts authority, Like if you tell them to do something and they trust your heart, they know that you're there for them and that you're genuinely interested in them and you want to help them. There's something about a child that kind of like wants to please you. And it's easy as a teacher to have a teacher's favorite because that student doesn't fight with you, but they seek to please you. And then there's kids that just like, everything you say, like don't do it, they do it. Like don't kick the chair, they kick the chair. Don't say that, don't stand up, they stand up. And they won't listen to you. Because why? They don't trust you. They don't trust your authority. And I was a youth pastor in K-Town for a long time in the urban context. And so urban contexts are a little bit harsher environments for kids to grow up in. They have to have more of their defenses up. And so it's like to win the trust of certain students' hearts, it's different when it's not a safe environment. And it's like, do we live like the kid that trusts God and trusts that He has what's best for me, that He really is leading me in the right way, that He has my best interests in mind? Or do I live like God is this authority that doesn't really want the best for me, and He's just kind of there in His self-interest? He's there because He has to be. And we're just kind of like, yeah, God, like I like that part, but I just don't agree with that. And we just kind of pick and choose, and we like try to make sense of it, and we pray for God to bless certain things, and we go to Him sometimes when it's hard, but it's like there's a dysfunction there almost. Because we're treating God without a fundamental level of trust. We don't trust that He cares for me. I don't trust that God's ways and God's heart and His design for my life is actually the best. And I think that's where we struggle oftentimes. We don't really trust God. I don't trust that God will provide for me unless I do this and that and go into this job. I don't trust that I'll be fulfilled in my life if I give everything to God. And it's like when it comes down to it, God is like, yo, my child, I want the best for you. I have the best for you. Will you trust me? Will you trust in my design? Will you trust in my timing? Would you trust in the ways that I'm leading you and training you? And it might be tough. It might be not what you expected. But will you trust that I'm leading you? Will you fully trust me? And I feel like the lack of trust in the body in general, I'm talking about me included, so no one in particular. But I feel like because there's a general lack of trust in the body of Christ, genuine, like we could say we trust God and we could kind of act the part and we could have somewhat of a trust, but I feel like still there's a misalignment from what we say we believe and how we live. And I believe that the discrepancy between that, how much we say we trust God and how we live and how much trust that life really communicates, I think is such a barrier and a challenge for the world. I feel like the culture's response to Christianity is a lot dependent on that, because they're like, you know, culture says that. They're like, Jesus we love. We respect Jesus. His teaching sounds good, but church, believers, Christians. And I believe that it's like we say we follow God and we trust God. But oftentimes we deal with anxiety, our fears, our dreams, what we feel entitled to, what we feel like will satisfy us. We take a bite of the same pie. We move the same way. We respond in similar ways. The honest answer is do I live for God or do I live for my satisfaction? Do I live for my career? Do I live for my security? Do I live for, X, Y, and Z? When we say we trust in God, and when our actions and our walk communicate differently, what kind of witness? I'm like, okay, it makes sense. It makes sense. It's not as compelling. Christianity seems more like a label. And I feel like in our passage today, there's something that Jesus has that, and he should, right? He's the Son of God. He has something. He has a way to cut through all of it. And you might get tripped up on the fact that he seems so strict about divorce and what do you mean? Is there no concession? And we could get sidetracked on that. But I really believe the heart of the matter and the heart of Jesus really is he's going directly. He's confronting the religious spirit, the religious establishment. And he's saying, know me. Know me. Stop being so concerned about the law and come into my heart. Experience my grace. Know me for real. Seek to know me. Pursue my heart. And I will show you great things and unsearchable things that you have never known. The self-serving nature of the religious establishment was what made Jesus uncharacteristically harsh and angry. And next week's passage, Jesus embraces these children. And it's like such a stark contrast. To the religious, he's harsh and straight and direct. But to the children, he's so soft. He's so compassionate. And I believe that it's because this spirit is so self-serving and so self-righteous. And it's such a stumbling block to actual relationship with God that Jesus is so harsh. And so the creation order in our passage, it elevates marriage from just a mere contract between two people in front of the state or just even a celebration. And it elevates it to more than an institution, but a covenant before God. It's a covenant. It's a commitment of two people uniting into one in front of God. This is the significance of marriage. It's beautiful. And I think there's a misunderstanding of that. And I feel like COVID, it happened a little bit where I don't want to, it's not to say it's wrong or anything, but I feel like a lot of people got married on paper first because it was just a tough time. So I understand the circumstances around it. But it's like to get married on paper and be recognized before the state and then move in together and to live together and then start that and then have a celebration with my loved ones later on. I'm not condemning it because I think there's concession for it. But I feel like within this understanding of what the union, a covenant between two people is, what's most important is not you get a paper that the state recognizes. What's most important about marriage is that you make that covenant before God, before a cloud of witnesses. Because ultimately, marriage is that covenant before God. And so hopefully it helps some of you young ones later on. Be intentional with how you guys do your marriage. Because I feel like it's not so that it's right as so much as it's wrong or right, but I feel like it'll be more blessed in the end. My wedding ceremony, it's a worship unto God. It's us saying, God, I'm committing my life to this person in front of you, first and foremost. To love my wife as you love the church. So I'm not going to go into more of the marriage teaching because I feel like it will take us another whole sermon. But I did want to touch upon that. That Jesus is, through his response, he's elevating marriage as a sacred union between man and a woman before God. It's sacred. And it's also a reflection, and I mentioned this before, a reflection of God's covenantal love to his church, to his people. So I'm going to read that for us, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 28. And it says, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are the members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. And so the mystery of a man loving his wife, Christ loving the church, giving his life for the church. Marriage is a reflection of Christ's sacrificial love for us. And we, in human, it's imperfect, but as we get married, and for some of us that are single, for those of us that are married, some of us that are seeking to get married, it's like marriage is a reflection. It's an opportunity for us to reflect God's glory and his love to the world in how we love our spouse. It's a beautiful gift. And it elevates marriage just above this contract that benefits two people. Oh yeah, we'll get married if it benefits our finances, if it benefits my career, if I feel good and you feel my happiness. Like, it's beyond that. It's not just a contract for myself, but it's a covenant relationship that I enter into with God at the center of it. In verse 10 of our passage today, the disciples were surprised. When they were in the house again, it says in verse 10, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. And so disciples are so surprised that they asked Jesus. And I think Jesus, even in the private quarters with his disciples, he outlines this as well. He says, the original design, how I designed it. And if someone's been divorced, there's grace for you in the gospel. This is not Jesus saying there's no concession for you. But I think Jesus is really wanting the disciples. If you follow our series, he's really trying to help the disciples see there's a difference between moralism and religion and following Jesus. And he's really wanting them to see the benefit of you walking in my original design. It's the best for you. To trust me above everything else. Does divorce still happen? Yes. Is it allowed or not? It's not God's intention. But Jesus wants you to know that the details of the law isn't as important as his heart. And I'm going to invite the worship team to come up, his heart and his love for you guys. I want to invite the worship team to come up. We live in a world today that's where relationships are disposable. And I still wasn't in the era of online dating or dating apps. And so for those of you that are younger, I definitely feel like there's definitely challenges that you guys have in your generation. But we live in a world where relationships, just even the message that just how it's functioning, how the world's running, is that relationships are disposable. And I'm not against dating apps, by the way. I think people can certainly find, and many of my friends have found, their significant others through that. But we live in a world that just in general is communicating that relationships are about convenience, relationships are disposable, and relationships are self-serving. And if it doesn't make you happy, it's not working, move on, upgrade, find something better. But I believe that through our passage and through Scripture, God offers us a different reality. He offers us a different vision of what it means to commit and to love. And I believe that it sounds more radical in the backdrop of today because it's just so based upon convenience. And our passage's title today is Convenient Covenant. God's covenant to you was not convenient. It cost him his life. It cost him the cross. Jesus did not love us. He did not commit to us out of convenience. But Jesus, he loved us beyond that. It wasn't even a question of convenience. He loved you so much. He cared for you so much that he sent his son to die on the cross, to live a life that you couldn't live on this earth. He became flesh, and then he died a death that you couldn't die, so that you could live a life and enjoy a life that you didn't deserve. And I believe that the core message of the gospel reminds us of this, that God is a God that doesn't seek convenient covenants, convenient relationships, but he's deeply committed to you. And you think of the story of Hosea, whose wife was unfaithful to him again and again. And it's not because Jesus is weak. It's not because Jesus is a beta that he kept coming back, that Hosea kept going back to him. But the depth, the length, the height, the extent to which God would go to express his love for you, to sacrifice his love for you, it's so beyond what we commonly experience in our human life that it blows our minds. And I pray that today you'd be reminded, if you've never experienced the love of God for yourself, that you would experience the length of his love for you, his commitment for you. And if you have experienced that before, I just want to invite us today to meditate on his love, to receive his love, that he is so committed to you beyond your behavior, your past, what you're even trying to do for him and cook up for him. God loves you and he's committed to you.